Not too long ago, I made a video discussing albums that I had changed my opinion on, evolved my perspective about, basically albums that I felt I was wrong about, either when initially reviewing them or just hearing it for the first time and me not taking to it immediately or even within the first few weeks. I just felt like, yeah, these were records that I had such harsh opinions about first time around that my opinion now isn't reflective of, to a point where I needed to update how I feel about it. But if you ask me, when it comes to my taste, I'm way more right than I am wrong. So I'll be going over a small little list of records and albums that I felt like I'm glad I never changed my opinion about, and how I felt the first time is how I still feel to this very day. And the first one that I'm gonna highlight is Astroworld. I never had a harsh opinion of a record like Astroworld. I kind of always enjoyed it from a bit of a distance because there was nothing about it from a conceptual standpoint that drew me in, but the sonics and the production and the aesthetic and the overall orchestration of this project is what really had me head over heels for it. But I knew after repeat listens that this isn't going to hold my attention, especially with a narrator like Travis Scott. And that isn't to say that Travis Scott isn't a good artist, because I love Rodeo. If you knew me in 2014 and 2015, I was probably one of Travis Scott's biggest advocates. He could really do no wrong, even though he wasn't rapping well back then either. I felt as though his aesthetic fit him so much more on Rodeo than it did on Astroworld. Instrumentals with enough variation and evolution within the same track to kind of add to and match his kind of dead style, aloof delivery. He came off as much more robotic and lifeless on earlier records, and it honestly felt pretty intentional when you matched his tone with a lot of the instrumentals that he was using. But on Astroworld, when he's rapping, it doesn't really appear the same way, at least to me. It feels like more focused and more attention to Travis Scott trying his best to rap, but still not really having much of anything of substance or vocal talent. And don't get me wrong, I still consider Astroworld to be a great project, but my favorite song off of that record till this day is still Can't Say, and that is solely because of Don Toliver. The personality and the eccentricity and the flamboyance that he brings to that track, the energy, the life that he breathes into it. It's rare that that album peaks like that. Other times that I feel are great are the additions from Sway Lee on a track like R.I.P. Screw, whose contributions are so small but add so much to this very pink and relaxing background, something Travis just kind of fails to do. I don't really consider Astroworld a failure by any means. I just don't really think that Travis Scott is the most exciting part of it, and my favorite moments generally don't include him. But if I'm gonna give him credit for anything, the planning for what this record is supposed to be and what it looks like, the world that he's trying to create, he needs to be acknowledged for that at least. But my feelings about Astroworld are pretty much the same as when I first listened to it. It's still a healthy addition into the book of Travis Scott. And speaking of books, this video is sponsored by Audible. Audible is celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip-hop, introducing original stories from some of your favorite hip-hop icons with their Words and Music series. That's right. One of, if not the most influential genre of music in our generation has been around for half a century. And what better way to celebrate than to highlight one of my personal favorite artists, Snoop Dogg. Snoop Dogg is definitely one of the earliest pioneers of not only West Coast rap, but hip-hop in general. He's been a core representative of the genre longer than I've been alive. It was easy to assume you know most of his story until you hear his new Audible original audiobook, Snoop Dogg, From the Streets to the Suites. Snoop talks about humble beginnings, his early days being raised by a young mother, how the first song he ever bought was an Anita Ward record, and how strongly his family influenced his musical taste. It's really easy for me to hear his story and so easily identify parts of myself within it. My own mother's favorite record was that same Anita Ward song that he talks about in this story. I, much like Snoop when he was young, found myself crate digging through my family's CDs and cassettes to put myself on to new music, attempting to put myself on to whatever my brother and sister, his mother and father were listening to, the same way he talks about in the story. Snoop is one of the people that I found while I was digging through my family's music collection. It's just kind of poetic how that inquisitiveness just connected all of our generations immediately. I doubt Snoop knew that he'd be one of the diamonds in the rough for someone else that he was looking for so many years ago. This story is truly an immensely priceless tale from one of the earliest faces of hip-hop, and I encourage anyone watching this to go listen for yourself at audible.com/StreetstoSuites. There, new members can try Audible free for 30 days or text code StreetstoSuites to 500-500. It's a rare opportunity to hear a story never before told by one of hip-hop legends himself, so go give it a listen. The next record that I'm glad I never changed my opinion about was 808s and Heartbreak. 15 years ago when this album came out, I listened to it and I didn't like it. And 15 years later, I listened to it and I still don't like it. I don't want the respect that I have for what this record did for music in itself to be misconstrued with my enjoyment for it. I love and respect that it gave Drake his early start. It opened up the door for people like The Weeknd to be a thing when creating records like House of Balloons, for example. Some of my favorite musical moments from beyond that point have inspiration directly from 808s, so I can never disrespect what this album breeds. And it wasn't just because at the time of this record's release, Kanye went through an entire musical shift, something that was such a drastic change from an album like Graduation. For me, my main issues with the record were always how it felt like an open, empty canvas. Like Kanye had made a few strokes throughout each song and let the rest of the song do what it wanted. I didn't feel as connected to what Kanye was saying, not only because I wasn't old enough to listen to the record at the time, but if I could say something about it now, I would say it's probably not written to the degree that Kanye's earlier work was. I would hear this album and think how much room it has and how spacious it seems without actually being filled up. Historically, the atmosphere of this record has always been so spacey and foggy for me. An album the world calls a classic that I have zero interest in listening to. Care for Me from Saba is easily one of my favorite records ever. It's been 5 years since it came out, and I love it till this day as much as I did back then. Although I could strongly relate to what Saba was talking about here, being a young man just ridden with grief and this guilt of kind of being one of the few left of your childhood. Even years later, this album still feels like words from a young man who knows that it's wrong to give up, but is still trying to look for reasons to keep going because he still believes and hopes for the world that he's working toward. He knows what happiness is and how bright it can feel, while at the same time existing in a space and in a world that so easily takes all that away. This inability to accept compliments without immediate self-doubt. I mean, dare I say, after 5 years, I feel like this album is underrated. I hate that word. I hate using that term, but this is a level of reflection that's unmatched by other records in its time. I actually hate this next album because I don't know when we're gonna get another one. Process from Sampha. I'm in love with this record. 6 years later, I still love this album, and I feel like a complete idiot for asking for more music from this man because I never know when it's actually coming. Give me something, please. I was right about this album being gorgeous, beautiful, a great representation of a sensitive soul, describing his connection to the world, but a lot of that was still based off of the assumption that new music would be coming like relatively soon. My boy, it has been 7 years. The next would have to be that most recent Baby Keem album. Now, as a fan of Baby Keem, I would say since pretty early on, this album threw me for a bit of a loop because I didn't expect Keem to go in as many different directions as he did. He had already had a lot of success up until that point, had been on the XXL cover and everything so I didn't really see much of an incentive for him to experiment as much as he seemed to on this most recent album. Not to say that made it bad by any means, but it was such an ambitious attempt without proper planning, in my opinion. The only support majority of this record gets is from Kendrick. In those moments where there are weird yet creative vocal performances from the duo, looking back on some of those performances a few years later is a little bit more awkward for me than it is enjoyable. The top of the morning things still don't hit till this day. And I feel the same way about a good portion of the attempts that were made on that record from Baby Keem. Despite me appreciating his creativity and his attempts to break through barriers on that album, even with heavy inspiration from artists like Kanye, I can't say that it left the mark that it intended to or even had the impact that it may have been planning. Still, the best of that record is enjoyable. But have I changed how I felt about it since first listening years later? Nah, it comes off less like a complete album and more like a book of drafts. But that's all I'll include for this video. I might do a part 2 soon. You let me know in the comment section down below what records you were right about that the general public may have switched up their opinion about, but you stood firm and you're glad you did. I'll be reading the comments, and I'll see y'all soon.